Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the final weekend of February 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, journalists explore their top stories, adding insights to those headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Ortve D. Van Gie, PhD economist, and bring the latest in K-12 education news. Today, we'll look at the latest from the Department of Government Efficiency. We'll hear more about a Washington state bill that would put limitations on initiatives, and we'll discuss the state of the border. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With the latest on DOGE, it's our Dan McCaleb.
The Department of Government Efficiency continues to steamroll through federal budgets, cutting what it identifies as wasteful use of taxpayer dollars. DOGE announced this week that in just 1 month of its existence, it has saved American taxpayers $55 billion, some of which could be returned to taxpayers in the form of checks. Democrats warn that such drastic cuts will have consequences. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, at Thursday's White House press briefing, Deputy White House Chief of Staff Stephen Miller said the Trump administration is considering sending 20% of the DOGE savings back to taxpayers. Tell us more.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And drew some headlines with that and even more interest to the already infamous DOGE effort to cut federal spending. I mean, there's a lot to be said here, Dan. I don't know if you hear that sound. Here outside of D.C., you can hear the distant screaming of federal bureaucrats.
I think I can make that out.
Yeah, I hear it all 24/7. It's like banshees in the distance. But I think Democrats are in a difficult spot here because, on the one hand, when they're defending U.S. aid and other policies, they say, "Oh, it's only 1% of the federal budget. Why are we cutting federal aid? It's only 1% of the federal budget." But then the next day they turn around and they say these cuts are so drastic and so draconian that they're going to they're going to cause all these issues. And so, which is it? Are these cuts so insignificant that we shouldn't waste time on them? Or are they so draconian and drastic that they're going to, just end life as we know it? And so I think there's a lot of rhetorical games going on here. Overall, DOGE is, cutting. And as far as in dollar amounts, there's a lot of money being cut, but as far as percentage of the budget, it is still pretty small. They're talking about sending the money to taxpayers about 20%. That could be, 1,000, 5,000. It just depends on how high the number gets. I don't think anyone should expect that number. That check is not coming next week. So, it could come. I think it's very possible. I think there's probably some appetite among Republicans to do that, maybe even in an election year, but I don't think that's not so imminent. That's going to be more of a long-term thing. DOGE has until July 4th of next year to really put forward their big picture spending cuts plan. And so it's possible they could wait until they submit that plan once they have the big round number of cuts that they're hoping for. I mean, Trump has said hundreds of billions. Musk has said almost up to $2 trillion. You're going to have to do some pretty drastic cuts to get to $2 trillion. But, so I wouldn't expect that check in the mail next week, but it is pretty interesting. The cuts are making a difference, and, it's putting Democrats in a tough spot because they seem unwilling to just admit that many of these cuts are necessary. And so soon they might be on the side of, we don't support cutting waste and sending money to the American people. And just mark my words, Dan, they're going to say that these checks cause an increase in inflation. That's coming. So that's my prediction of the day.
Casey, the U.S. national debt is more than $36 trillion. Government watchdogs have been warning for years and years that that spending is on an unsustainable path. Miller also said at yesterday's White House press briefing that 20% could be returned to taxpayers. 20% of the DOGE savings could be returned to taxpayers. 20% could be used to pay off U.S. debt. We're still in budget deficits. I think under the last Biden administration, the last fiscal year, we were deficit spending by $2 trillion. Why wouldn't 100% of these DOGE savings go to pay down the U.S. debt?
It's politics, Dan. You want to get the money back into the hands of the American people. It's a political win. It's drawing attention. Trump is supposed to be the populist president for the people, regardless of what Republicans or Democrats think about it. I mean, that's how he's really made his brand. And so the Democrats are going to say these cuts are too intense. Republicans are going to say, who knows? Republicans are in total disarray at this point. They are the party of Trump, or they have no identity. But a traditional Republican might say we need to just, do the smart, responsible thing and not send out these checks. A Republican of 20 years ago would not send out the checks. They would be too afraid of some, article on CNN that would say that the checks will cause an increase in inflation. But Trump's going to send it out to the people. And it's probably a good idea. It's probably going to help more Republicans get reelected for them. And they can keep, going forward with the agenda. I mean, these are going to be, a few $1,000s per people, and it's the people's money. And I think long term, it probably will help the cuts go further forward, because the only thing keeping DOGE alive is the will of the people. There's plenty of Democrats and Republicans, actually, who do not like DOGE. They want to put it to a stop. They don't like the cuts. They don't like how the president has taken such a proactive role in cutting spending when, really spending is Congress's job, but they've done such a poor job of it that the president is kind of exposing them for how weak they've become. They've delegated all their authority to these federal bureaucracies, which don't listen to them anymore. They don't respond to oversight. The Congress has become the weakest branch of government because they've created the bureaucracy, and Trump's exposing that. And so I think a lot of these lawmakers are embarrassed. You can say the money should go to the debt, but honestly, right now, the money's still negligible. You're probably not going to pay down the debt with the actual funds. It's the thing that's going to pay down the debt is the long-term structural changes. And that's what we're still looking for, Dan. Is DOGE just kind of a gimmick that cuts a little bit for, a year or two? Or are they going to be able to do long-term structural changes that get the deficit down? Because like you said, it's been around $2 trillion. Before COVID, it never got over $1 trillion. Now it's been averaging $2 trillion. If they can get the deficit down, honestly, Dan, they don't even have to pay off the debt. If they just get the deficit down to zero and keep it there, that will pretty much solve most of our problems.
In the few seconds we have left, Casey, and other DOGE news this week, a federal judge ruled against a coalition of blue states seeking a temporary restraining order to end these DOGE-related cuts. Just briefly tell our readers about that.
Yeah, so basically these states sued and said, hey, Elon Musk can't do this. It's going to hurt our states. So we need an emergency, immediate restraining order. And the judge said, no, you're not getting that. But, I was reading through the ruling, and there are some things in here that Musk and Trump should be worried about, because the judge seemed to suggest that even though they're not going to receive an immediate order, that there's a lot of things Musk is doing that this judge says could be unconstitutional. And so I would not be surprised if there does end up being an order stopping Musk that gets appealed all the way to the Supreme Court.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on the Washington State bill dubbed by critics the initiative killer, it's Eliana Kernodle.
Washington State Democrats on Tuesday passed a bill out of the Senate Government, Tribal Relations, and Elections Committee dubbed by critics to be the initiative killer. Here with more on this is the Center Square's Washington reporter, Carlene Johnson. Carlene, what would the bill change regarding Washington's initiative process?
It would be pretty dramatic, the changes. And just for a little bit of backdrop, in Washington State, the initiative process and the right to the initiative process is built into the state constitution, Article 1, Section 2. And it basically, gives an individual or a person who wants to work with an organization the right to go to the Secretary of State, file intentions to try and get a law changed or amended or overturned, or even a new law. So that is built into the Constitution, basically as a check and balance, right, against the legislature. And Senate Bill 5382 would make some really dramatic changes to the current law, which of course would then require a constitutional amendment, right? The bill directs the Secretary of State in validating the signatures to verify the address that is listed by the person on the initiative of the referendum. Critics say the issue with that is that person might have just moved and they might be putting their current address, on the petition, and the Secretary of State has a different address for them on file. It shouldn't really be an issue if they're in fact a valid registered voter in the state of Washington, but that would be an invalid signature. And the other big issue with it is something that's called false reporting. And that means that the signature gatherer would have to sign a declaration on every page saying that, I swear to the information that is written here on it. I know it's accurate. And they also can't be paid for their signature, the person. Well, signature gatherers don't pay a person to gather signatures, but the signature gatherer themselves might be paid by an organization like Let's Go Washington, which was behind the initiatives that passed in 2024, or 3 of the 7 initiatives that passed in 2024. So it would put a real big burden, critics say, on the signature gathering effort and really just kind of stifle that opportunity. And even the Secretary of State told some local television stations in Washington this week, and he's a Democrat, Steve Hobbs, he said, no, anything that is going to put more of a burden on the voter to exercise their constitutional right is not something that he supports. But at this point, it has, passed out of committee. So it's going to be interesting because the fight is far from over in Olympia.
So what's the motivation for this?
Yeah, as I mentioned, those ballot measures from last year, everything from, returning the right for police pursuits, the income tax, repealing of the Climate Commitment Act, or an attempt to, that one didn't go through, the Parental Bill of Rights. There were 6 initially gathered signatures for that went to lawmakers for the 2024 session. They ended up adopting 3 of them. The one to ensure no income tax, the one to restore police pursuits, and the one for the Parental Bill of Rights, Initiative 2081. So it took up a lot of time and effort and, the debate clock, if you will, in Olympia. And majority Democrats ultimately agreed to pass those 3 I mentioned. The other 3 went to voters, and then eventually Initiative 2066 to retain natural gas as an energy choice also went to voters. That one passed. The other 3 were rejected in November. But it sucked up a lot of the time in Olympia, and majority Democrats didn't like that. And so critics, including every Republican who, opposed Senate Bill 5382, say, you just didn't like the measures that came. Now, keep in mind, oftentimes there are initiatives that are brought to the people by majority Democrats, including an initiative a few years ago, 1639, that contained a suite of gun control measures that ended up getting those through. And the former attorney general, now Governor Bob Ferguson, had to fight to protect that one. But now they want to undo the initiative process. And this is one of the most contentious issues during this 2025 session, for sure.
So what happens if this ends up passing?
Yeah, that's the interesting thing. If this thing ends up going through, and it very well may end up getting passed, but it would also require it to go to voters. And you're going to have 2/3 of people supporting these great changes to the initiative process before it could be approved, because it would require a constitutional amendment. So you'd have to have 2/3 of lawmakers saying yes to this because it's a constitutional amendment. And then it would have to go to voters to say, yeah, we agree with them. We want to amend this and kind of change how the initiative process works in Washington. That's a heavy lift. That is very unlikely to happen, because even many, Democrats, as I mentioned, the Democrat Secretary of State in Washington, Steve Hobbs, say, the power ultimately rests with the people to hold government accountable. And one of the ways, that Washington voters have for that is the initiative process. making that very, very difficult for people and probably not willing to sign something if they might get in trouble for it, or go out and gather signatures if they're going to get in trouble for it. Mind you, they're up to a year in jail is included with that penalty for the false reporting. You're really going to quash, people's ability to go out and gather those signatures. So even though the bill may go through, which is going to be a big enough issue in and of itself, it would be unlikely, I would think, that voters, 2/3 of voters across the state of Washington would be willing to, amend the state constitution. This could be just the first try, and then they come back and make some changes to this bill in subsequent sessions. And maybe it becomes more palatable at that point. But it's just dramatic that it's gotten already to this point, and it's a testament to, the power of the initiative. So we're going to be watching it really closely.
Well, Carlene, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Carlene. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the border, it's Dan McCaleb.
Illegal crossings at both the southern and northern U.S. borders have plummeted since President Donald Trump took office. Mass deportations are well underway, and the federal government has declared multiple cartels and other transnational criminal organizations as foreign terrorist organizations. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, though not all Americans support the president's policies related to the border, a majority do, and it's remarkable how a change in the administration can completely flip something that's been known as the border crisis the past 4 years on its head. What has the Trump administration been able to accomplish in its first month in office?
I mean, so much to say here, Dan. It's a remarkable change at the southern border. There's so much we could go back and forth and what's happened over the past few years, but we'll just say border crossings, border encounters down 95%. I mean, and this is in 1 month. The 95% down. Trump sent 1,500 troops to the southern border. He started a massive nationwide deportation program. He has really unhandcuffed these border patrol agents and allowed them to focus on catching people and turning them away instead of what they were doing before, which is doing paperwork for the illegal immigrants they're letting into the U.S. I don't think people realize that. Many times the majority of border patrol agents were just processing illegal immigrants to come into the country instead of out there catching them and turning them away out of the country. He reinstated Remain in Mexico, which is basically if you're seeking asylum, you have to wait. You can't come into the country and wait for asylum approval. You have to wait till you're approved, then you can come in. And during the Biden administration, all these people would just apply for asylum and he'd say, yeah, come on in, we'll process your paperwork later. And they hardly ever got to it. And if they did and denied your asylum claim, it's like, well, you're already in the country and no one's going to come looking for you really, because ICE was hardly doing any deportations, just only on like the worst criminals and not even that at times. And so it was a policy, a program set up to allow the illegal immigrants to come into the country en masse. And they did it's over 12 million illegal immigrants came into the U.S. under Biden. Just a massive number. 12 million is more people than, every large city in the U.S., basically. More New York, Chicago, Houston, all that. So it's a massive number of people that came in. And now, Dan, the word has gotten out because there's many media reports, Telemundo, other, Spanish language media, that is reporting that just huge droves of people are turning around and heading back south and giving up, not trying to come in anymore because they've heard how hard it is, that if you do get in, you're going to get deported. And so now all these Central American countries in particular are dealing with this huge influx of people coming from Mexico back south to their country of origin because they've basically given up on coming into the U.S. illegally.
Casey, President Trump this week also directed federal agencies to stop funding public benefits for those foreign nationals living illegally in the U.S. That's got to be a deterrent too, you would think, huh?
Yeah, I mean, it sends a message. And Trump has, his reputation precedes him, and that's why these migrants are turning around. On this federal funding issue, I think this is not so simple as this order maybe makes it seem. The states and Democratic governors really, I think they're going to give Trump a hard time on this. It's going to be hard to enforce this, there are Democrat states like California that are probably looking for a reason to pick a fight with Trump. Legally, he's already facing other legal challenges. And so I think enforcing this order is going to be hard. There's many Democratic states that spend a lot of money on illegal immigrants, and it's probably going to be hashed out in the court. Now, some of those states will say, no, we don't spend money on illegal immigrants. But what they do is they do not check someone. They basically don't check if someone's an illegal immigrant or not. And that's their way of paying for illegal immigrants, even though with like for certain programs where they're supposed to check if you're, an illegal immigrant or not, they just don't check. And so they say, well, we don't do that. We don't, fund illegal immigrants. It's like, well, but you don't make sure that you don't. And that's your purposeful policy to make sure that you do. And so it's kind of disingenuous among some of these Democrat-led states. But, and of course, these federal programs are sometimes interlinked and intermingled with the state programs. So if Trump really wants to enforce this order, he's going to have to follow up and be consistent, because we've seen with his other orders that, he releases them, but people don't actually obey them. So he's going to have to go, program by program, and that's really what DOGE is doing. And that's really the power of DOGE, is to go program by program, line by line, to make sure that these federal bureaucrats who run these programs, who send out this money, are actually following the executive order. Because even already, Dan, we've seen that they haven't yet. I'll give you another example of the way this is happening. Trump banned DEI, and his Department of Education released a letter saying schools and school districts that have DEI policies could lose federal funding. But I just wrote about a report yesterday that from Parents Defending Education that showed that there are thousands of school districts that have DEI policies on their websites. And right now there's, many of them still have them up. And so who's going to go and actually look into this to make sure these schools do change their policies, that they actually do it not name only, that the federal funding actually is pulled. So there's a lot of, the devil's kind of in the details in all this funding battles.
Returning back to the border, Casey, Secretary of State Marco Rubio this week said that the Trump administration was formally designating these transnational criminal organizations such as cartels from Mexico and other Latin and South America countries as foreign terrorist organizations. Just very briefly, what does that mean? Well,
it really gives President Trump the opportunity and a choice to make where he could really unleash the U.S. military, U.S. Intelligence capacity, possibly SEALs teams, Army Ranger teams against the cartels to do real lethal damage. I mean, it would really kick off a war, because the cartels are heavily armed. They're pretty organized. They have a lot of money. Of course, they don't have the same technology that we do as far as surveillance and aircraft, but they're heavily armed. And so it's no small thing to come against these cartel guys. They're also infiltrated inside the U.S. as well. It's not like they're just in Mexico. So it's really like starting a war, but given all the, I think it's 100,000 overdose deaths a year, most of them from fentanyl, and much of that fentanyl coming from the cartels, maybe it's worth it to go after these guys. I guess time will tell.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. What did Illinois Governor Pritzker say about President Trump in his budget address? What cuts is DOGE making to the Department of Education? And how much more does it cost to live alone versus with a spouse or a roommate? All that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting you may have missed at centersquare.com. U.S. House leaders are optimistic about their early work on crafting a budget, but outside groups estimate the spending plan could add $25 trillion to the national debt over the next decade. Part of the disconnect is the extension of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is set to expire this year and would lead to tax hikes for Americans if not extended. Extending the tax cut provisions could considerably add to U.S. debt if there are no corresponding spending cuts. The House and the Senate continue to work on separate continuing budget resolutions. President Donald Trump said this week he would fire all Biden-era attorneys at the U.S. Department of Justice. Trump's move is the latest in his effort to clean house, particularly at agencies that have fallen out of favor, from USAID to the DOJ. President Joe Biden fired nearly all Trump-appointed attorneys when he took office in 2021. With Trump's decision to follow suit, the round of firings, once considered controversial, may be a feature and blunt tradition of a new administration in Washington. Ohio's Republican race for the gubernatorial nomination should officially add a third person next week. Former presidential candidate and Cincinnati businessman Vivek Ramaswamy filed paperwork with the Secretary of State last week to begin accepting campaign contributions. He's expected to formally announce his campaign for governor on Monday, with stops planned in Cincinnati, Toledo, Columbus, and Cleveland. Attorney General Dade Yost and former Morgan County Board of Education President Heather Hill have already announced runs to secure the Republican nomination for Ohio governor. The Trump administration is moving to hit the brakes on New York City's first-in-the-nation congestion pricing program as Governor Kathy Hochul and other Democrats vow to fight the decision. On Thursday, the U.S. Department of Transportation released a letter to Hochul explaining its decision to, quote, terminate approval of the program, which it previously approved under the Biden administration. In the letter, Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy criticized the congestion pricing program as more about raising revenue to support transit than about reducing congestion. Duffy said the department will work with New York State officials to end toll operations. Illinois taxpayers are off the hook for Michael Madigan's future pension payments now that the longtime former Illinois House Speaker has been convicted of corruption. Madigan, a Democrat, has received payments from the General Assembly retirement system since he retired in 2021 after 50 years in the State House. When a retired former elected official is convicted of a felony, the pension benefit is suspended the first of the month following the conviction. Madigan collected a pension worth $158,027 in 2024 and received $580,811 between his retirement in 2021 through 2024. Pursuant to state statute and board policy, the retirement system does not recoup benefits paid before a conviction. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on comments from Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker, it's Dan McCaleb.
Governor J.B. Pritzker gave his joint State of the State and budget address Wednesday, and while his record $55.2 billion spending plan was the focus of the speech, he brought national attention to himself when referencing Nazis 6 times while criticizing President Donald Trump. Joining me to discuss this is Illinois Associate Editor Greg Bishop. Greg, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler killed 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. How and why is Governor Pritzker comparing Trump's administration to a regime that committed genocide?
Yeah, it's something that as we got an advance copy of the speech, quickly read through it. And, the speech talked about some of the history of the state of Illinois and Abraham Lincoln and the importance of the state to get a balanced budget. And he threw out a couple of different other policy proposals I'm sure we'll talk about. But the last 5 minutes of his speech, which ran about 40 plus minutes, focused on Nazi Germany. And he talked about the Nazis that wanted to march in Illinois decades ago and how the ACLU stood up and actually fought for their free speech rights. But ultimately, he kind of talked about all of that in context of the new Trump administration. And what he says was a warning to Illinoisans and elsewhere, people that need to possibly be a stop to any type of autocratic regime that could come out of the Trump administration. And, the governor, he mentioned Nazis 6 times in that last 5 minutes. But when we asked how that's not an insult to more than half of the American voting public who voted for Trump, Pritzker pushed back and said that he wasn't comparing or saying that Trump was a Nazi or that Republicans were Nazis. He was just trying to highlight the concerns he sees of a Trump administration trying to buck federal courts trying to be an autocrat, and really he wanted to raise that issue as something pretty prominent in his speech about Illinois. But obviously the fallout from this, instantly, some Republicans started walking out of the chamber during that joint session of the General Assembly. And then afterwards, Republicans critical of the governor's speech, not just about the substance of the spending plan, which, again, I'm sure we'll touch on here, but many of them demanded an apology from the governor, saying that his comments were out of line, saying that they were juvenile, and even saying that they were dangerous. State Representative Adam Niemerg said that Pritzker's rhetoric really would amplify those who would want to do harm to Republicans, and seems to go against the political violence that Niemerg said Pritzker claims to condemn. And even today, as we're recording this Thursday, the Illinois House is in session. State Representative Stephen Reich got up in the middle of floor debate for a point of personal privilege and demanded an apology. And Reich said, in no way have Republicans been anti-Semitic at all. He said that Republicans at the Illinois State House are the ones that have been filing resolutions in support of the state of Israel. And he said that Republicans are far from being autocratic, and the governor should know that. And Reich referenced the 40 plus emergency declarations and hundreds of executive orders that the governor used during the COVID-19 pandemic, essentially ruling the state by executive fiat during that time, something that Reich said is very autocratic, and the governor should realize that. But even those comments from Reich got some pushback from Democrats on the House floor. State Representative Daniel Dittich said that as a member of the Jewish faith, he took offense to Reich's comments. And Democratic State Representative Jennifer Gon Gershowitz said that Reich had no right to make those comments. So I don't think this is the last we're going to hear of the criticism and the fallout from the governor's references to Nazis during his budget speech. But clearly, it's something that's ruffling a lot of feathers as we are, not even a month into the Trump administration.
Greg, Trump was the target of 2 assassination attempts in the run-up to the November election. There were plenty of criticisms of both sides for the hateful rhetoric against each other. And now here we are into February. Trump has been in office for about a month, and that rhetoric continues. Governor Pritzker had to know his comments were going to bring him national attention. There's been speculation that Pritzker might be considering a run for the White House. Does this fuel that even more?
I imagine, the governor's had a lot of time already on various cable news channels to talk about Illinois and what he's working to try to have policies in place to counter anything that they see as troubling coming from the Trump administration. And there's been speculation for years that Pritzker is vying for a spot at the White House, even, during the Kamala Harris era, when Joe Biden stepped down from being the nominee and Harris was installed. Pritzker was vying to possibly be the vice presidential pick. But now here we are with the 2024 election behind us, a new president in the White House, 2028. It's rapidly approaching. So I think over these next 2 years, the governor, he hasn't announced yet that he's running for re-election for 2026. But there's a ton of speculation all over the Capitol and beyond that Pritzker's lining himself up to get more into the national spotlight so that he could possibly get that high profile on the national stage and put his hat into the ring for the 2028 presidential election.
Thank you, Dan and Greg. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the cuts to the Department of Education's research wing. It's Eliana Kernodle.
Nearly $1 billion in contracts for the Institute of Education Science has been cut by the Department of Government Efficiency. Joining me to tell us more about this is Chalkboard News editor Brennan Clary. Brennan, what exactly is the Department of Education cutting here, and what's their defense?
Yeah, so the Institute for Education Sciences has a number of different functions, but they basically are the sort of the data center for the Department of Education. And they have a number of different projects and a number of different contracts. And essentially, they were founded in 2002. This is according to the Department of Education. They were founded in 2002 to, quote, fund development and rigorous testing of new approaches for improving education outcomes for all students. And so there's, like they're trying to keep tabs on how students are doing, how the education system in America is performing, and sort of, coming up with those different kinds of metrics, essentially, through data points. But the Department of Government Efficiency and the Department of Education said that, these are not, a lot of the spending there is not necessary. So according to the Department of Education's Twitter or X account, they said $14 billion and countless contracts later, our students are no better off. And then they have a graph showing the different kinds of student outcomes, even before the pandemic, and said that there's not really a noticeable difference there in terms of how students were averaging before, from the inception of the Institute for Education Sciences to the pre-pandemic level. So, the Department of Education is making this argument that we've spent a lot of money on this, and it actually hasn't done anything to tangibly move the needle towards student success. Like, we maybe have been generating this data, but we haven't been able to translate that to better outcomes for students. And, that's $14 billion since 2002 on the Institute for Education Sciences. And these are contracts. So there are different things that will get cut from this. There are also things that, are going to stay the same because they are valuable and they're not going to get, or they're done in-house maybe, and they're not done through a contractor. So I think that there is, a little bit of nuance there. And there's also, too, to point out, like, if you have these kinds of mandates or you have these kinds of, federal programs, you will have people who are riding on those kinds of mandates in order to make their own business work. And like, they are supporting that general cause, but then you have to wonder, like, well, how much is that going to help, right? And so I think that that's what the Department of Government Efficiency is doing with this, is saying, like, we don't actually need this. It hasn't helped move the needle. We can cut the spending, so let's do it. And so again, instead of improving outcomes for students, here's where taxpayer dollars were going. So this is from the Department of Education's post. $4.6 million in contract to coordinate Zoom and in-person meetings. A $3 million contract to write a report that showed that prior reports were not utilized by schools. A $1.4 million contract to physically observe mailing and clerical operations. So this is kind of where the taxpayer funds are going, is to sort of like self-referential, or like sort of this meta analysis of like how things are going for the Institute of Education Sciences. So that's kind of the argument for a lot of the cost cutting.
And how have critics responded?
Yeah, they've said that gutting the research wing and sort of killing the data center for the Department of Education will make it harder to ensure that students are receiving a quality education with the best practices. So Chester E. Finn, who's a fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, he said in a recent commentary piece that the Institute for Education Sciences is, quote, where we learn what is and isn't functioning and what might work better. And he said DOGE, if it actually sought the government efficiency in its name, could help modernize IES, perhaps even put out to pasture some sacred cows, such as the regional labs. And he was talking about what he called useless centers at universities that are sort of in this line, but they don't actually do anything to help out. So they get a lot of funding, but they don't actually create like a lot of useful content or data. And he continued, but slashing and burning, as happened the other day, won't improve matters. It's just going to weaken the foremost truth squad in American education, the chief sponsor and funder of rigorous analysis, reliable data, and clear-eyed evaluations in a realm that needs more of those things, not less. And likewise, Heather Pesky, president of the National Council on Teacher Quality, she was very adamant against DOGE's decision to cut almost $1 billion in contracts from the Institute for Education Sciences. And he even compared it to the deadly wildfires in Los Angeles. And she said, watching the Department of Government Efficiency indiscriminately cancel contracts at the Institute of Education Sciences feels a bit like watching the fast-moving Los Angeles wildfires threaten the homes and lives of the people there. Like my friends evacuating the affected areas, hastily grabbing their precious treasures before they were gone, my team rushed to download irreplaceable data that we depend on to answer critical questions and promote a strong teacher workforce and high-quality education for all children. Yet this is a wildfire of our own government's making. So essentially, her organization relying on this kind of data to hold, the systems accountable, to hold, to advocate for high quality teachers on behalf of students. She said, there's no other substitute for that. Like if the government's not going to provide that information, where are you going to get it from? And how are you going to sort of ask these questions to hold teachers accountable, hold different kinds of parts of the education system accountable. So it's a very like tough question. I think you can look at it from sort of this broad angle, and the Department of Government Efficiency certainly is, of like, a long view of 2002 to now. How has this helped students, right? Is this actually moving the needle? And then they're saying we're going to cut it. And then on the other side, you have these other education organizations, like advocacy organizations, saying, look, this is actually working the best. And what we can do is throw out some of it, maybe. So that's the Fordham Institute sort of version. It's like we should throw out some of these things that are clearly not working and are clearly not moving the needle and clearly not helping. But then, we should still have this kind of data available to see what is working and what is not working. And then on the other side too, with the teacher quality, how else are you going to get that information if it's not coming from sort of this federal source, right? Where you have, more funding than states, and you have that collective sort of, we can take a look at all these different metrics nationwide. So I think it is a great question. I don't think that there's not any easy answers here. And so, this is kind of it is kind of a, like, let's burn it down and try something new sort of approach from the Department of Government Efficiency.
Well, Brendan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.
Thanks to Eliana and Brendan for that update. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss the singles tax is PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, every once in a while, the Zillow comes out with something that, makes me go, I like that. It's pretty good. They did that this week, and gosh, they got a lot of run on it. I'm actually reading this report on Forbes, so good media week for the Zillow. Let me set the report up, and you can talk about it. So the report is, if you live single, if you live on your own, and there's a lot of people that choose to do this, there's this concept of the singles tax. So if you're living on your own in an apartment renting, that you're going to spend about $7,500 a year more than if you had a roommate or roommates plural, and shared expenses for, like, whatever it might be, certainly the rent, itself, but your utilities, your internet. I don't think most singles have cable anymore. It's sort of an old person's game, but certainly subscription services and things like that. Talk to me about this phenomenon, Dr. O.
Well, it's really simple, right? It's like rent growth. Rents increased a lot in the past couple years during the pandemic. And although rent growth has slowed, rents are still roughly 33% higher than they were before the pandemic. And so if you're living alone, right, on a single income, it's hard. It's much harder than it was a few years ago, right? And now, the extra that you're paying for living solo, right, continues to increase. And it's now estimated at $7,500 or almost $7,600, up from $450.
That's real money. We're talking about post-tax dollars. And so if you're living single and you're just getting started, an extra $7,500, $7,600 a year at your disposal. That could be disposable income or investable income. That's a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's worse in big cities like New York, right? Like New York City is a city. It's a massive job center. It's a city that attracts a lot of young people that are, very often renting first, right? And just trying to make it. They're getting a job in the big city and they're trying to make it. And according to Zillow's, other company, Street Easy, the Zillow New York City website, Street Easy, the singles tax is now $20,000, right? It's just expensive. It's expensive. And so I guess housing costs rising so fast is definitely an incentive to get married. It's an incentive to get a second paycheck. to help cover the expenses.
Right.
And of course, again, the big cities, those are cities that don't build a lot of housing. New York City, San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle is on that list. Los Angeles. These are cities where the price of housing and rents increases really fast because the supply side is not able to keep up with the demand for housing. And why is that? It is that case because, well, first, they're constrained with land, geographical constraints to building, right? You got a lot of mountains and you got the oceans on each side. And then they also have some of the strictest building regulations, land use rules across the country. And this is well known. And so those markets tend to have lower home ownership rates, right? People tend to rent there for longer. It's much more difficult to move up the housing ladder in those cities, despite the much higher incomes that you can command working in one of those cities.
All right, so let's extrapolate this a little bit. Even if you chose to say, like, live in a like a city like Rockford, Illinois, or Erie, Pennsylvania, or wherever, someplace where where rents are more affordable. I mean, you're still subject to this reality that the living alone approach.
Well, absolutely, it makes sense, but that's it. It's always been the case, right? Ultimately, I think people get married. Why do people get married? I mean, there are benefits. There are, I love, when I was in grad school, I did a lot of research on marriage and divorce. And it's funny because you can actually quantify the gains from marriage, right? There's a value to being married, whether it's in the labor market, whether it's in the fact that you have somebody to share household duties and household work with. Right. There's a utility, there's a benefit from a gain from being together and maybe even starting a family and having children, right? But there are also these massive financial gains, financial benefits, right? And those financial benefits can also explain why different types of people marry each other, right? So, for example, if you look at the data, you see that the people with similar education, earning potential, tend to marry each other.
Interesting.
And so, I think those are little things that are fascinating about the marriage market that we don't talk about often enough.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. O. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Kruger on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.